Hey guys, how's it going? Today's topic of the video is gonna be about object comparison. We'll be mainly focusing on different types of comparison. Those are referential equality, manual comparison, shallow equality, deep equality, and for the last, JSON.stringify method. So it depends on their reference value. If two objects reference to the same memory location, so they reference to the same object in the memory, they will evaluate to true. But if they reference to the different objects, even if the structure and content inside those objects are exactly the same, the comparison will eventually return false. So let's begin with the referential equality. We have three different ways to compare objects in this case. Those are strict equality operator, the loose equality operator, which is two equal signs, and object.is method. So these three things are doing exactly the same thing basically. They are asking if this object references to the same object as object 2. So it checks whether object 1 and object 2 reference to the same memory location, which in this case is false because object 1 references to the slot 1 in here and object 2 references to here. But in case of object assigned object, which is basically the same as object 1 because this and this, they both reference to this location right here. They grasp the same object, so this equation evaluates to true. Same goes for loose equality operator and same goes for object.is function. So now let's say I want this to return true, the object 1 and object 2, because they share the same content. They both have p property and the value is 1. So I want to check if the content inside these objects are the same. The content of p property is the same as content inside the object 2. So what should I do? The simplest thing I can do is basically manually write the code to compare these properties. So I can write the compare p function, and inside I take these two objects and compare their p properties. This method is actually good if the object is small and easily maintainable and the content is not gonna change anytime soon. But this method becomes really hard when the object becomes big and you'll have to write a lot of code to compare every properties inside the object. So in this case, let's see object 1 and object 2. It returns true. I'm gonna show you right here. It returns true. And same goes for this two right here. So this returns true and this returns false. Now, why did this happen? Even though they grasp different objects, the content inside them are the same. The p property is the same as object 2 p property. But in the case of different object, which has the p property set to not one string, it's gonna evaluate to false because it's not the same. Okay, now let's move on to the shallow equality, which is basically comparing the every content inside the objects but using the iterator like this. So what we're basically doing here is we're taking all the keys from object 1, which is p1, p2, p3, and all the keys from the object, the big object 2. And now the first thing we're doing is we are checking if the key number in the first object is the same as key number in the second object. So we have 3 keys over here and we have 3 keys over here. So they are the one step further to evaluate to true, because if I had something like p4 and v4, these two objects are not the same anymore. So we can easily tell by counting the keys in the objects if the objects are the same, because keys 1.length is now 4 and keys 2.length is now actually 3. So they would not be the same and we should return false. So that's the first step of checking. So now what we do next is we iterate over all of the keys and we are comparing the values of those properties. So we are comparing p1 of big object 1 to p1 of big object 2. So they equal to each other and it's gonna return true. So this right here is not gonna return false. It's gonna continue until we find the different value for the property. Instead of v3, I had different string. So now let's check these two objects. Let's say the big object 1 and big object 2. I'm gonna say this, run the code. So it's gonna evaluate to false because it compared the p3 value right here of the object 1 to object 2 p3 value, and it said they were different. But if I had the same value like with 3, let's run the code again. Now it's gonna evaluate to true. You might think that it's a flawless comparison between the contents of the object, but you're gonna be wrong, because the problem appears when we have the object as the value inside the property. So what happens here is this object is different from this object, as we mentioned before. They might have the same content, but they refer to the different objects in the memory location. So whenever the code is gonna compare like object 1's stuff property to object 2's stuff property, it's gonna say that they do not equal to each other, and the return value is gonna be false. So the code is gonna say, hey, this object is not the same as this object because the stuff property value are the different, because the stuff properties value is the different. So what do we do now? This problem takes us to the next step, which is the deep equality, which basically does the recursive check. So this function is a recursive function. Now, what is the recursive function? You might be familiar with it, but if you don't know, the recursive function is the function that calls itself during the execution. So inside this function, we might call the deep equal function again according to the conditions. Now let me explain further. So what we do here is we are checking if the property is the object. In this case, whenever we go to the stuff in the iteration, we check if the value of stuff is the object. If it is the object, then we call the deep equal function again to check the content inside the stuff and compare it to another stuff. So we are gonna use the deep equal function once again to compare the content inside the deep object 1's stuff property to deep object 2's stuff property. So it looks something like this. First we have to find out if the property, the value of the property is the object. So we create the separate function isObject to write the less code, which basically checks if the given value is the object. Now why do we write does not equal to null right here? Well, this is because we have to avoid the very strange behavior from the null, which is basically the type of null. As you can see, the type of null returns object. So we don't want that. If the value is null, like let's say some prop null, we should not call the deep equal again on this right here, because the type of null is object, but it's not the object in this case, because we don't need to iterate inside null. So we check if it's not the null and the type of object is the object, so it's basically an object. So in this case, stuff is an object. So let me show you an example. Let's say I'm iterating on those two objects. In the case of name, what it's gonna do is first it's gonna do something like this. Well, first it's gonna get all the keys from object 1, which is name and stuff, and it's gonna get all the properties from the second object, which is the same. So now the next thing it's gonna do is it's gonna compare the lengths of these properties to the length of this, which is comparing 2 to 2. So it's not gonna evaluate to true, they are not different, so it's not gonna return false, it's gonna continue. So then we are iterating over the first array over here. We are iterating over this array right here, and we are getting all the properties. So let's say I'm on the name, I get the key. In this case, the first key is name, so we're getting the name from object 1, which is basically some nested object 1, just a string. And also from the second object, the name is also the sum nested object 1. So now we are checking if these two values are objects. Our objects is in this case calling the is object on the first one, so it's gonna call like this. It's gonna call is object 1 and is object 2 on these strings right here. So it's gonna return false because those are strings, they are not objects, and so the R objects is gonna return false. Now whenever the R objects is false, now this part right here is not gonna happen, so this is gonna return false. So if this returns false, this case right here, now we move on to the next case, which is using the OR operator. If they are not object, then we are checking if the values are not equal to each other. So we are checking the primitive values basically. We are making sure they are not the object, and we are making sure that they equal to each other. So if they are not the object and they do not equal to each other, then it's gonna return true. If this returns true, the second part of the OR operator, the whole if is gonna return true. So we are making sure that these primitive values equal to each other, and if they are not, let's say I have sum object 2 right here. Now the second part is gonna make sure if it's not the object and they do not equal to each other, and then it's gonna return false because it says, hey, this right here is different from this right here. But in our case, it's actually the same. So this whole part is not gonna happen. First, because they are not the object, and second, they are not the object and they are the same. But now what happens when we move on to the stuff property? So let's say I move on to that one, which is basically just an object like this, prop1 value 1, and I'm gonna copy this. So now what happens in this case? In this case, the R objects is actually true because the is object on value 1 is true, and is object on value 2 is also true because these two values are both objects. Now, because our objects are true, this right here is gonna execute. It's gonna make sure that these two object contents are not the same. It's checking if the content inside the first object is not the same as the content inside the second object. So we're calling the deep equal once again. So now what happens in this case? What it's gonna do is it's gonna check the primitive values inside these two objects and compare them to each other. So in this case, whenever we call the deep equal, it's gonna come to this part once again, and it's gonna check the primitive values inside. So the code is gonna make sure that the prop1 is not an object. I mean the prop1's value 1 is not the object, which is the case right here. So our object is gonna evaluate to false once again, and because it's false, we are gonna check if the value 1, in this case this value 1, is not the same as value 2. I mean the value 1 from here is not the same as value 1, which is not the case as well. So if these both parts are gonna return true, the OR operator is gonna choose from here because it returned true, and it's gonna return false if they're not the same. So if they're not the same, they do not equal to each other, it's gonna return false once again. But because they are the same, the value 1 and value 1, they are both the same, this part is not gonna happen. So that's really cool thing about deep equality. You can basically check every content of every object and not worry about the reference of the objects inside the properties. So I'm gonna give you an example to make sure that it's working. So in this case, it must return false. So let's save it, refresh, and let's see. It's true because all the content inside deep object 1 and deep object 2 are the same. The structure is the same, property names are the same, and the values inside the properties are the same. But now let's say I change it to 2, refresh the page once again, and it's gonna return false because it checked that the content inside the stuff object is the different. And for the last, I wanted to show you a really cool way of comparing two objects, which is using JSON.stringify method. Now this method is by far one of the best methods to compare objects, but it has its downsides. And I'm going to show you why and how. So you're basically turning the first object into a JSON string and the second object into a JSON string. And voila, that's about it. You just have to compare the strings and get the result. But the downside from this is that if the sequence of the properties is the different, now let me show you right here. I'm going to delete this. So let's copy it right here. It's gonna evaluate to true. But let's say I change the sequence inside here. Surprisingly, it's gonna return false because now the strings are different. So let's see the first string. The string looks something like this. And for the second object, it's the different. As you can see right here, first is the integer property and then is the string property. So be aware of this downside. So yeah, that's about it. I hope you liked the video and the code is helpful for you. I hope you learned a lot of new things that you didn't know before. And make sure to subscribe, like the video, and see you later. Bye.